Hello and welcome to Medyascope. Today we will be discussing the causes and implications of the protests in Iran. Joining me from Spain is Dr. Mehrdad Khonsari. He's a former Iranian diplomat and the General Secretary of the Green Wave movement. Mr. Khonsari, welcome to the program.
Good afternoon and many thanks for inviting me.
The protests are reported to be ending, yet there's a lot to be discussed. Can you explain your take from the demonstrations? What's behind the discontent?
Well, of course, the situation in Iran has, over the years, the economic situation in particular has become particularly worse as a consequence of continued sanctions and Iran's more or less international isolation, which ended only really with the signing of the nuclear agreement about 2 years ago. But in one way or another, the Iranian economy has suffered over the course of the last almost 40 years due to failures on the part of the government to focus on real issues, lack of managerial skills, and many other associated problems. Now, all of these have sort of multiplied and have made the situation more aggravated. And of course, the political situation in Iran has not improved either. In the years since the revolution, people's belief in what they had thought would come about as a consequence of the revolution has not materialized. Democracy, human rights, issues of that nature have suffered in all these years. So it's what we are witnessing today in Iran is an amalgamation of all these various factors, amplified obviously by the worsening economic situation and poverty that is sort of prevalent in Iranian society. And these are the reasons, underlying reasons for the protest that occurred last week.
There was some analysis that suggested that the demonstrations had started by some factions within the regime. Specifically, they were referring to Ahmadinejad. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that, not just Ahmadinejad, the opponents of the Rouhani government, you have to bear in mind that compared to the kind of governments we have had in the last 39 years, this present government is one of the better governments. And it's tried to steer Iran away from radicalism, introduce a measure of moderation, both in its internal and external outlook. And of course, it has enraged the hardliners and the extreme right who pursue different agendas. And the demonstrations last week was triggered by some of those right-wing opponents of the Rouhani government, but it quickly got out of hand and it got into a situation which even surprised them. But there is a measure of truth in the fact that right-wing elements, along not just Ahmadinejad, but people equally opposed to the Rouhani government, did trigger the protests that sort of got out of hand and gained a momentum of its own last week.
So I understand that the main dimension of the protests were economic and the political unrest developed afterwards.
Yes, the initial causes for the protest, the initial causes for the demonstrations was because of rising, prices, the cost of living going up, the introduction of a new austerity budget by the new government, by the recently re-elected Rouhani government, which obviously reduced some of the subsidies, was leading to an increase in the price of fuel, petrol in particular, and an epidemic in the chicken business, which resulted in the poultry business, which resulted in the price of egg sort of multiplying something like 20 times, which triggered all these things. The main causes were economics. You have to bear in mind that irrespective of its natural wealth and its prime position as a main exporter of oil and gas, Iranian standards of living has been falling consistently. And it's much less than what it used to be 40 years ago. And in comparison, especially with its neighbors, that have seen their economies improve, such as the economy in Turkey or some of the Arab countries of the Persian Gulf, Iran has suffered. So economic deprivation was the main cause. But when you get, thousands of people into the streets and they start chanting, albeit for economic reasons, then the lack of democracy, the lack of social freedoms and issues of that nature and the frustration of the nation because of the religious dictatorship all sort of, come in and give the demonstrations sort of an aura which it did not have when it initially started.
There were regime-oriented claims that there was an international dimension within the triggering of the protests. Would you agree with that?
Obviously, Iran has been a subject of major propaganda has been used by foreign elements against the Iranian regime over the course of the last 40 years. But as you rightly mentioned earlier, you cannot spur a demonstration of this nature without some form of organization. And that organization initially came from people entrenched within the regime, and as you rightly pointed, the right-wing opponents of the present government. Obviously, once the people were out on the streets, these were fueled by incessant propaganda coming from various news agencies and so on that have access to Iran and to which Iranian people have access to. And of course, social media plays a very important and crucial role. But to say that these demonstrations were fabricated by external powers, I think is a bit exaggerated. The causes for the unrest is there. Iran could easily, demonstrations could easily gain a momentum of its own because of the various existing grievances and the fact that the causes of these grievances have not been dealt with. And frankly, in the present situation within Iran, without serious structural changes, there is no way that the economy is likely to improve or social crucial role.
So from what you're saying, I understand that unless the economic problems are overcome, perhaps with structural developments, the main reason for the protests cannot be overcome. So it may repeat itself.
Exactly. Yeah, it's like, what has happened, obviously the extent of the demonstrations has died down, but and of course, the regime has acted quite strongly. They have arrested around 1,000 people. They've killed about almost 25 people have died as a consequence in the course of these demonstrations. And the key elements within the regime have made it clear that they will not allow for these demonstrations to go on, and they have made certain promises. And even President Rouhani has said that he would resort to a number of measures to try and deal with these grievances. But the fact is that, it's like providing aspirin to a cancer patient that needs major surgery or, chemotherapy. What the government is offering, what the regime is offering, is not in any way remotely near to the kind of solutions that is required. Those solutions require that Iran, that sanctions, economic sanctions against Iran be lifted, Iran be allowed to become reintegrated into the world economy, for capital to flow into Iran, for investments to flow into Iran in order to deal with issues like unemployment and, inflation and key economic factors that need to be addressed. So and none of these can happen unless the Iranian government assumes a direction that is completely different to the direction it's been pursuing, especially led by hardline elements under the supreme leader. So unless those changes occur, the economic situation is not likely to improve and social problems will not go away.
There were many expectations from the international media on how this crisis would be resolved. From your perspective, what does this imply for the future of the regime and the opposition as well?
Well, I think that, the point is that of course, when you talk about the opposition, the external opposition to the regime is unfortunately not quite in tune with the sentiments of the people on the ground. They have all jumped on the bandwagon of condemning the regime, but condemning the regime and resorting to the kind of slogans that were pertinent 20, 30 years ago does not create a great deal of confidence with people in Iran. People in Iran want change and they demand change, but they are cautious and weary that in the course of demanding change that Iran, which has been stable within itself, does not become another Syria or Iraq in the name of wanting to promote democracy and human rights and economic reforms. So, you have to, put everything into perspective. What the Iranian people want is for reforms to be instigated and for the regime to begin the process, cooperating in the process of change. And they are hopeful that the majority of people within the ruling establishment can come to this realization. Now, I have to say that, when the Iranian Revolution happened almost 40 years ago, people believed in Khomeini, they believed in resurgent Islam, and they believed in the revolution. Those ideological factors are no longer pertinent to contemporary Iran. And about 80–90% of the ruling establishment, people like like President Rouhani or former President Khatami, who is a very popular change and adapt to new circumstances, to restore its ties with the international community, to essentially divest itself from the kind of ideology that had isolated Iran. But all the major or key levers of power in Iran are vested in about 10% of the ruling establishment, who no longer sort of tied to the original ideology of the regime, have a self-interest in terms of their own financial situation and power positions, who are resisting this kind of change. So I think that what we are going to be witnessing is increased pressure on this constituency that is dwindling as we go with each passing day. And, excuse me.
Yes.
And what you have to bear in mind is that change has to occur in a way that does not upset the stability of internal situation in Iran. And most Iranians are very cautious in order not to take or resort to measures that would leave them in a situation that is worse off than what they are confronted with today.
What you explained is actually very different from the protests in 2009. Is that right?
Well, the 2009 protests were basically political. They emanated as a result of what the protesters called a fraudulent election result. And people came out demanding that, that the fraudulent elections be addressed. And the demonstrations were initiated and took place first and foremost in Tehran. This time, and of course, it was led at the time, or it was tied to the fate of former Iranian Prime Minister Mir Hossein Mousavi and the former Majlis Speaker Mehrdad Khonsari, who were the de facto leaders of that protest. This time it's different in the sense that, first of all, the demonstrations did not begin in Tehran. They occurred in many cities and towns, some not very well known to many Iranians throughout the country. They were not for political reasons, they were for economic reasons, but once they started, they gained political, you might say, political connotations were added to them. But the point is that they were not shouting in favor of any particular party or leader. There was some reference to the monarchy, there was some reference to key reformist elements, you know, within Iran, but essentially it was an economic protest against bad governance and, you know, the kind of dictatorship imposed by the supreme leader who had seemed to be impervious to the demands of the general public.
Were the supporters of the Green Wave movements included within this protest as well, or were they cautious and waiting to see what was happening?
No, I think that the supporters of the Green Wave or Green movement were amongst the crowds, but they did not use the slogans which they had used. So the banner of the Green movement was not sort of mentioned or shown or displayed in any of these protests. So whilst they are part of the public and they, you know, sort of participated with the general public, but it did not have any connotation that these demonstrations were in any way related to the Green Movement.
I understand. So we will be expecting and waiting to see whether the Iranian government will do any structural changes within the economic framework.
Well, as I said, you know, it's not just changes within the economic framework that they need to make. In other words, updating the Iranian economic system, updating the banking process to be in line with international banking. But the point that they have to address is major political, you know, macro political issues. In other words, Iran has to try and end its policy of international isolation. It must embrace activities and a diplomatic line that is in tune with world diplomacy, that does not try to fight ideological wars against the United States or Israel or this or that. It must conduct its foreign policy in a way that is in the national interest of the Iranian people. It must extract itself from the kind of rhetoric that has isolated itself. Only then will economic sanctions be removed. Only then will the major reasons why capital is not flowing into Iran be no longer a problem for the Iranian economy.
Mr. Khonsari, thank you very much. It's been a very informative talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for watching us. Today we talked about the crisis in Iran. See you next time.